Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for day 3 of my mystery week, and happy Halloween. Today I've got 2 cases for you which may or may not be interconnected, both of which happened on Halloween or the day after. We're talking about 2 separate Jane Doe cases, the case of Orange Socks and the Walker County Jane Doe, and I honestly believe that if these kinds of true crime videos can help solve any crime in the world, it will be a Jane Doe case. It's just about getting the faces of these people, these Jane and John Does out there, and maybe, just maybe, somebody will recognise them, or somebody will know one of their distinctive features, or will know of a second cousin that went missing one day and was never found again. All it takes is for one person to know one thing and we can solve an entire case. First, we're going to talk about Orange Socks. Now, Orange Socks was the name given to an unidentified woman found on Interstate 35 in Georgetown, Texas on the 31st of October 1979. She was dubbed Orange Socks because all she was wearing when she was found was a pair of orange socks. Apart from this, she was fully naked, so as you can probably guess, she was sexually assaulted. Orange Socks was white, between 5'8" and 5'10", and she weighed between 140 and 160 pounds. She had hazel eyes and almost shoulder-length brown hair, but it had kind of a reddish tint to it. And she was estimated to be between 15 to 30 years old, although a lot of people think that she's more likely towards the older end of the spectrum. Her body wasn't in great condition. She didn't take care of herself that well before she died, but she had never broken a bone in her body. Her legs were unshaven and covered in bug bites and scars from old bug bites, and her toenails were unusually long, like she couldn't afford clippers to cut them. Her fingernails were painted red. She had a hairline scar underneath her chin, and she suffered from salpingitis, which is the inflammation of the fallopian tubes, most likely caused, or it was caused, by gonorrhea. 2 of her teeth were missing, but the rest of the teeth were fairly well maintained, but she'd never had any crowns or fillings, so she hadn't had extensive dental work, she just had good teeth. Alongside her orange socks, she had a silver ring on the middle finger of her right hand, and this ring either had an abalone or a mother of pearl stone in it. She also had her ears pierced, but I don't think she had any earrings in. She was determined to have died from manual strangulation. She had lots and lots of bruising around her neck, but she also had lots of bruising across the rest of her body, but specifically on the left lower back. Injuries indicated that she'd been dragged from the highway over the guardrail and dragged through the grass before her body was dumped. At the crime scene, investigators found a bloody towel which they said was used as a kind of makeshift sanitary towel. This, combined with all of the other factors, led investigators to believe that this was a woman who was struggling financially. She wasn't that well off. 2 matchboxes were also found at the scene. One was from a Motel 6 and the other was from a hotel in Henrietta, Oklahoma. The general consensus was that Orange Socks was from Oklahoma, or at least was in Oklahoma before she ended up in Texas, and she was either a drifter or a hitchhiker. As far as Jane Doe cases go, Orange Socks was in a really good position, and it's really strange that she's never been identified by anyone. Her face wasn't obscured by any injuries, and she had very distinctive features. She's the kind of person that you could look at and remember. It's almost beyond belief that not a single person has recognised her or has come in to say they saw her anybody else in the days beforehand. Years later, one woman came forward. She calls into America's Most Wanted and says that she actually saw Orange Socks earlier in the day hitchhiking on the side of the road. But other than that, we have no idea what her movements were before this. Orange Socks is buried in the Oddfellow Cemetery in Georgetown, Texas. Her grave reads, "Unidentified woman, 1979. And that was it for Orange Socks for quite a few years. There was very little progress made. Nobody recognised her, nobody came forward with any information whatsoever. This is until a few years later when notorious serial killer Henry Lee Lucas confesses to her murder on June 2nd, 1983. Now, Lucas said that she was a hitchhiker. He picked her up from a turnpike in Oklahoma City. He said that he doesn't remember her name exactly. It was either Joni or Judy. He said that the 2 of them went to a truck stop together where they ate lunch, and then they later had sex in a park. But he said that the sex just didn't satisfy him. She just wasn't any good. And so later on they're driving down the road and he asked her for sex again and she says no. He said, "I was drinking beer. I don't know if something was wrong with her or something was wrong with me. I killed her not long after that by strangling her with my bare hands. He then says that he undressed the corpse and had sex with it. He said that he vividly remembered dragging her over the guardrail because she weighed quite a lot and he skinned his knee whilst he was doing it. Now this sounds quite likely until you actually hear the full story of Henry Lee Lucas. Now he was first put in prison for murdering his own mother, Viola Lucas. They were having a fight as to whether he should return home or not to care for her, and so he just stabs her in the neck and murders her. He was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison in Michigan, but after 10 years there was too much prison overcrowding, and so they let him out. He was let out in 1970, and in 1971 he is convicted of trying to kidnap 3 schoolgirls. He goes to prison again for another 4 years before being released in 1975, and this is where he befriends Otis Toole, who would later go on to become his partner in crime. He moves in with Otis and his parents, and whilst he's moved in with Otis, he strikes up a close friendship with Otis's niece. This was 15-year-old Frida Powell, or she was known as Becky to most people, and eventually Lucas manages to persuade Becky to run away with him, and so they go to the other side of the country. They first go to California and then they end up in Texas, where they're working for an 82-year-old woman named Kate Rich. And eventually, of course, he ends up murdering both of them. He said that Becky was too young, too whiny, and so he murdered her. He also murders Kate Rich. Eventually the police capture him and he does confess to them. He even leads the police to where the bodies were, even though the bodies were unidentifiable because they were so decomposed. It's sort of good enough. He led them to 2 bodies. But this is kind of where Orange Socks comes in. You see, Henry Lee Lucas loved to confess to murders. In his time, he confessed to anywhere between 600 and 3,000 different murders. And there is no way that he committed all of these murders. The amount of different places he'd have to be at once to be able to do all of the ones he confessed to, it just wouldn't work. But he enjoyed messing with the police. He liked leading them on a wild goose chase, but it also meant that he would get preferential treatment in prison. The police would literally take him out for meals at restaurants and take him to cafes. They would let him wander around without handcuffs on. He knew all of the numbers for the security doors. He had pretty much complete freedom, or as much freedom as one can have when they're in prison. And not only this, but police stations across the country started to hear about Lucas confessing to anything and everything, and so they started to contact him, getting him to confess to any open crimes they had on their books. It was easy for them. They could close off some open cases, and Lucas enjoyed confessing. If he confessed to a crime, it was fair game, and this way the police across the country actually managed to close 213 cases. Kind of a little bit unethical if you ask me. The Lucas task force was established to try and filter through all of these confessions and figure out which ones are correct, which ones aren't. Honestly, I couldn't get an exact number as to how many they managed to confirm. I think it was around 28 that they were like, yep, he 100% did these. But it may have been slightly more than that. Lucas would later recant most of his confessions, even going as far at one point as to say that the only person he ever murdered was his own mother. It was too late at this point. He was too far gone, and the police loved to use him to close all of their cases. They would actually take him into the interview room and let him look through the case files before turning on the recorder, and then they would let him basically repeat back exactly what was said in the case files. And then it was really hard to say that he was lying about anything because he knew details that only the police knew. And the tapes would also be stopped and started again constantly, almost as if the police were pausing it to tell him what to say next. And this may be what happened with Orange Socks. It's actually quite likely that this is what's happened with Orange Socks. Like I said earlier, he fully confessed to it, saying he remembered dragging her over the guardrail. He said exactly where he left her, details that only the police knew, but the police probably fed him those details. He actually later recanted the confession, of course, and there was actually zero physical evidence to match up Lucas with the crime. There was no evidence in the sexual assault. There was literally nothing there. Orange Socks is actually one of the murders that Henry Lee Lucas ended up going to trial for, but the defence had a good argument. They said that throughout his confession he was unsure, he kept contradicting himself, and nothing really made that much sense. They said that he was even shown photos of the crime scene before he did the confession, and that's how he knew exactly how the body would have got there, going over the guardrail, dragged through the grass, and he knew exactly where her body was left. And most shockingly, he was actually living in Florida at the time, and there was a work timesheet from Florida that showed that at the time of Orange Socks' murder, or around the time, he most likely would have been at work. For him to maybe make it work, he would have to drive from Florida to Oklahoma to pick up Orange Socks, drive down to Texas, going 70 miles per hour the entire time, not stopping once at all, even though he said that he did stop with her at a truck stop, and then to have to drive 70 miles per hour the entire way back to make it back in time for his next shift. Although it's possible, it's highly unlikely. Somehow though, out of the 11 murder convictions that he received, this is the only one that he got given the death penalty for. You've kind of got to question the justice system there when there's so much evidence to suggest that he didn't do it. He still gets given the death penalty. I think they wanted to make a kind of example out of him. However, the state senator at the time was actually George Bush, and George Bush managed to get this overturned because there just wasn't enough evidence, so it got changed from the death penalty to just another life imprisonment. So he may or may not have committed Orange Socks' murder. He did recant his confession, he said he didn't do it, but he may well have done. Like I said, he liked to lead the police on a wild goose chase, so who knows. Over the years there have been plenty of possible matches for Orange Socks, but not a single one of them has come back positive as of yet. On the 37th anniversary of her death, so in 2016, they actually did a new facial reconstruction of her, which is pretty detailed, so I'm going to put that on the screen now. This was done by the National Centre of Exploited and Missing Children. Even though she seemed to be a bit older, she may have been as young as 15, and she was also entered into their database. So if any DNA comes up, it may strike a match with her in their system. As of this year, the Doe Project have officially taken on her case, and leaps have been made towards her identification. As of just the end of September this year, so 2018, it was announced that there was new DNA evidence in this case. Preliminary forensic evidence here shows the woman's DNA as well as somebody else's DNA, and they haven't really given us much more information about this. They don't even know as of yet if the DNA is enough to test on, but this is huge. Not only could this lead to the capture of her murderer potentially, but it also could lead to her identification finally after like nearly 40 years now. As of the time I'm filming this, 31st of October 2018, I have no more information, but I have a feeling that more will come out very soon, so if you're watching this in a few months, maybe give it a Google and see what you can find. Now let's move on and talk about our second Jane Doe here. This is the Walker County Jane Doe. She was found just 1 year later on the 1st of November 1980 in Huntsville, Texas, which is about 2.5 hours drive away from Georgetown. This Jane Doe was found approximately about 6 hours after her death. She was found around 9 AM, meaning that she may have died from about 3 AM. She was found face down on the side of Interstate 45, and just like Orange Socks, she was also naked. A pair of red leather sandals were found near the scene, which are assumed to belong to her, and she was also found wearing a necklace, a brown pendant with some kind of stone in, and a gold chain. This is a little thing that makes investigators think Orange Socks and Walker County are connected, because both were left with jewellery. A lot of people would steal jewellery, especially something like a gold chain and a silver ring with quite a precious stone in it. Most people would steal them, but whoever killed these two women didn't. This Jane Doe was between 5 foot and 5'5", and she was very petite. She was about 105 to 115 pounds, and she was young. She was anywhere between 14 and 20 years old. It's most likely that she was towards the younger end of this because she looked really young. She had brown hair, once again with a kind of reddish tint to it, and it was cut in a quite fashionable winged style. She had hazel eyes, but not many distinctive features apart from a scar above her right eyebrow. Her ears were pierced, although she was wearing no earrings, and her fingernails were long, but she didn't have any nail varnish on them, but she did have her toenails painted pink. She was very well nourished, very well cared for. Her body was in excellent condition, and she'd had really good dental care throughout her entire life, so investigators believe that she came from a more middle-class family. She definitely had money. The fact that she likely had money and was very young, and so likely came from a family with parents, it's very strange that she's never been identified. Surely there's parents out there looking for her daughter, and it's not like she was neglected. She was so well nourished and really good condition. But her body had been treated a lot more brutally than Orange Socks. This Jane Doe had been strangled just like Orange Socks, but not with somebody's hand. She'd been strangled with a ligature, most likely her own pantyhose, and the rest of her body was covered in bruises as well. She'd been sexually assaulted with some kind of blunt object, but hadn't been raped, and therefore there was no DNA evidence there. When she was found, her pantyhose and her underwear were actually stuffed inside her vagina, most likely to stop all of the bleeding that was coming from her being assaulted with some kind of blunt object. It was really violent. Before her death, she was beaten extensively. Like I said, her entire body was covered in bruises, but most notably her lip was really swollen, as well as her right eye. And she had a really deep bite mark in the back of her right shoulder as well. It's suspected that the murderer, whoever did this, had definitely done this before. This was some kind of professional murder. Whoever had done this knew what they liked and knew what they were doing. But unlike Orange Socks, multiple people had seen this girl in the days before she died. And this is most likely because she seemed so young. She seemed too young to sort of be out on her own, wandering around. So people paid attention. Everyone who saw her said that she was wearing some kind of dirty yellow pullover, as well as a white knitted jumper with really deep, long pockets. She was also wearing jeans, and she wasn't wearing shoes, but she was carrying them in her hand, a pair of red leather sandals. This girl arrives at a gas station around 6:30 p.m. on October 31st, 1990, and she exits a blue Chevrolet Caprice. Now, I don't know if the girl was driving the car herself or somebody else was. I'm going to go ahead and assume that somebody else was driving the car. But I couldn't actually find that piece of information anywhere to confirm it. If she did get out of this car, that means that somebody out there knows who she is, or at least gave her a lift somewhere and has never come forward. She goes into the gas station and asks the attendant for directions to Ellis Prison Farm, and then she actually leaves towards it, walking on foot. It was as she was walking towards the prison that she's also seen by two different men at a trucker stop. And she goes into the stop, into the cafe, and starts talking to a waitress, and they're actually talking for quite a while. She says that she's visiting a friend in the prison and again asks for directions, and so the waitress draws her a map. And they're talking for a while. The waitress actually notices that she's probably too young to be out on her own. The waitress said that she suspected this girl was a runaway, and so questions her about it, asks her if her parents aren't worried about where she is, and she just replies with, "Who cares?" The waitress said that the girl actually mentioned that she was from either Aransas Pass or Rockport in Texas. The police worked really hard to identify this girl, as they do with all Jane Does, but this girl was particularly young, and therefore they thought that her parents must be out there somewhere looking for her. They went to the prison that Jane Doe was walking towards and asked all the inmates if anybody recognised her, and nobody did, even though she said she was going there to visit a friend. They also went to both Aransas Pass and Rockport and sort of showed her photo around, asking anybody if they recognised her. Still, nobody came forward. They even went into schools and asked schools if they were missing any students, asked students if they recognised her. Again, no one did. The police are pretty sure that she was of school age. When the waitress asked her how old she was, she said 19. But you know, when something's quite an obvious lie, the waitress knew that she was significantly younger than that. On January 16th, 1981, she's buried at Oakwood Cemetery in Huntsville. Her gravestone reads, "Unknown white female." Now, it's also widely suspected, as you can probably guess, that Walker County Jane Doe was also murdered by Henry Lee Lucas. He was still very much active at this time in the middle of his murder spree, but Jane Doe actually had one very distinguishing feature, and that was the bite mark on her shoulder. And the bite mark couldn't be matched to Lucas's dental records. However, before he went into prison, he did have pretty significant dental work done, and so his previous bite pattern, I suppose is what you call it, would be different from his one when he was in prison. Like I mentioned before, it's commonly thought that whoever murdered Walker County Jane Doe had done this before. They were experienced, so they likely were some kind of serial killer. Just in 1980 and I think 1979 alone, 4 other women were also found along the same interstate, and they all had very similar injuries. In 1999, this Jane Doe was exhumed to get more information about her height and weight, and they also took a DNA sample. They are really determined to get this particular case solved and find out her name, and over the years lots and lots of different facial reconstructions have been created of this Jane Doe. However, there's a huge lack of photos taken of her post-mortem, and so it's pretty difficult to create these reconstructions. In 2015, again, a photo surfaced of a young girl, again, who people think is most likely the Walker County Jane Doe. A brother and sister were looking through old photos of time they spent at a motel in Texas, and in the background of some of these photos was this girl. A girl who's called either Kathy or Kathleen or Kate or something along those lines. They said that she was staying in the motel with 2 adults. They don't know if it was her parents or just 2 carers, and she was talking about how she was going to visit a friend in prison. Now, the prison she actually talked about was a different prison called Sugarland, but there's a lot of things here that could link her. Of course, this girl, Kathleen, could have absolutely nothing to do with Walker County Jane Doe, but they're begging for anybody who has any information about this girl to come forward. Of course, again, as with Orange Socks, loads and loads of people have been excluded from being the Walker County Jane Doe over the years. These kinds of Jane Doe cases are among the most heartbreaking ones to cover, because not only do they lose their identity, but they're brutally murdered as well. They're given no dignity, even in death. Coming from a very privileged background myself, where I know that if I ever went missing, people would find me and they would search for me, I find it really hard to believe and heartbreaking that nobody comes forward to identify these girls. Everyone has relatives somewhere, or they have friends back in a hometown. Everyone knows someone, and it's just baffling to me that people can just go missing and nobody ever goes out to find them. Then again, there are a lot of Jane Doe cases where the families are searching and searching for years, and the police are searching for these victims' identities, and the two just never cross over. This is usually due to state lines or different laws, different communications, and they just get missed. Orange Socks is thought to have been struggling financially. She was a drifter or a hitchhiker, and she was most likely towards her late 30s. Walker County Jane Doe was a lot younger. She was likely from a privileged background, and she was probably a runaway, searching for a friend in prison. I do wonder how far investigators can go in searching for the families of these people. I do wonder if they can do something similar to what they did with the Golden State Killer and run DNA through an ancestry database and strike up a match with a distant relative. I know people do have some ethical questions when it comes to things like that, but I do think when it comes to reuniting Jane and John Does with their identities, this could be a really good cause. If you know any information about either of these Jane Does, I doubt anybody will do, but if you do, if you're from Oklahoma or Texas, I will leave contact information down below who to contact if you may know something. Yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in tomorrow's video. Bye guys.